Welcome to Zero. I am Akshat Rathi. This week, a different kind of solar power. Nuclear fusion is a reality. It's how the sun produces energy. But trying to replicate what the sun does here on Earth has been, to put it mildly, a challenge. For a long time, nuclear fusion as an energy source has been in the realm of science fiction. One can imagine powering civilizations that move across planets and maybe even galaxies. But bringing it back down to Earth, to our current climate predicament, fusion power could also provide emissions-free, unlimited energy. And wouldn't that be nice? Fortunately, after more than 50 years of trying, there is some success to report on. In fleeting experiments, scientists have been able to generate more energy from fusion reactions than the energy put into making them happen in the first place. Now, someone just needs to do it at scale. And there are dozens of startups trying to do just that. One of the most promising ones is CFS, or Commonwealth Fusion Systems. The startup CEO, Bob Mumgaard, began his work at MIT, where he worked with researchers studying plasma science. They designed a reactor called Spark, which could become the first large-scale reactor that generates more energy than it consumes. CFS has now raised more than $2 billion in venture capital. That's more than any other fusion startup. Clearly, investors are betting that if CFS succeeds, there's a big return to be made. How exactly? Well, to find out, I caught up with Bob at the Breakthrough Energy Summit in June. We nerded out about the science behind fusion, how CFS's bagel-shaped reactor, or tokamak, works, and how the company is going to put the billions of dollars it's raised to work. Bob, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
Even those who don't know anything about nuclear fusion benefit from it every day. The sun is the largest nuclear fusion reactor. If we could replicate that process on Earth, we could have unlimited energy. And we really started thinking about this about 100 years ago. So let's just start with the history of nuclear fusion.
Yeah, so basically humans have looked at the sun since humans existed, and they've wondered, well, how does that work? And you had, before we even understood that the nucleus was a thing, right? Before we had any of that, people thought, well, the sun must be burning wood, right? And you can calculate it up and say, well, if the sun, we figured out in the 1500s how heavy the sun was. And you said, okay, if the sun was burning wood, it would have burned out in 5,000 years. And so that was actually a big deal to everyone. Scientists were saying, well, the things can't be old. It must all be 5,000 years old. The sun would have burnt out. And so there's a big question, well, how is the sun still around? Once you found out that things were old, the earth was old and fossils and dinosaurs and all that stuff, you're well, what was powering the stars? And it wasn't until about 1920 that you had a combination of things. You had one, we found how atoms were built. They had a nucleus. And then you also had E equals mc squared. And
the famous Einstein equation.
Yeah.
Which said energy and mass can be converted into each other.
Exactly. And then a guy named Arthur Eddington, who was we're in the UK right now, a UK guy, astronomer, he realized that the helium, which they just discovered in the sun, only in the sun, was kind of like four hydrogens, but slightly light.
Yeah.
And he postulated out of nothing, just a pure inference, that inside the stars, they must be taking hydrogen, combining it to helium, and converting mass to energy. And if they did that, that would explain how the stars could be old. And not only that, but billions of years old.
It's not a bad hypothesis. If you're starting to build the periodic table, the first element is hydrogen. The second element is helium. Hydrogen is only 1 unit of mass. Helium is 4 units of mass. And you go, why is there that big a jump?
And you can look at it and you can calculate it up. And he does it in a 7-page paper, publishes it. And sure enough, like he got it like spot on. And then the paper even says if we could do this on Earth, we would like be able to solve a whole bunch of problems.
And so over the next 100 years, theory is then converted into some amount of practical work. And what we now understand is to be able to replicate what the sun does on Earth, we need to do it a little bit differently. The temperature of this hydrogen mass has to be 10 times more than what happens at the core of the sun. So the core of the sun is 15 million degrees Celsius. You need something like 100 or 150 million degrees Celsius for it to happen on Earth. And of course, at that temperature, you have to do something to hold it all together, because you heat stuff, it evaporates, it becomes stuff that you can't hold. So you have to hold it all together. And only then can you fuse these atoms and these nucleus going from hydrogen into helium. All of that is going to take a lot of energy. And there have been a bunch of reactions that have been done, but only one facility on planet Earth has ever got more energy out of that system than put in it. So before we understand what your company does, could you just talk us through the main ways in which we can make that reaction happen?
Right. So, we just jumped over here about 100 years of work where we realized, oh, okay, that's the reaction. And we confirmed it on Earth that that's the reaction in the 30s. And then in the 50s, we calculated, oh, if you wanted to do it on Earth, you would need to hold it all together. You need to insulate it very, very well. And then we built machines in the 50s and 60s, sort of guess and try. And it turns out that was way, way harder than we thought it was going to be. And so we had to make big computers. And we realized, well, there's maybe these few classes of ways you could hold it all together. So if you needed to reach the right conditions, which really are, as you said, hot, like 100 million degrees, dense, enough of it, and insulated, so doesn't cool off too fast.
Or doesn't burn everything around it too quickly.
Yeah, and really, if it got too hot and touched stuff around it, that would just cool it off, and so it's a double-edged beast. That if you needed to get those conditions, there was like a few physical forces that you could use to do it. And it turns out that you can sort of roughly categorize all the different ways to reach those conditions into first order 2 branches. And there's some stuff in between, but largely 2 poles. And one of them is you can use magnetic fields. So you can basically build a bottle using magnetic fields. It can be different shapes. And
the advantage is you don't touch it.
Yeah, so the magnetic field's basically, it's almost like a force field. Not quite, but like you basically build a magnetic bottle. So no materials touch it. And then the other way to do it is just make it happen so fast that it can't get out of its own way. So you make a pulse that happens so fast that before the fuel, the plasma, the hydrogen, before it moves out of its own way, it reacts.
It's like taking something and firing bullets at it from 360 degrees simultaneously. So the thing in the middle just gets compressed.
Yeah, exactly. And it compresses, and then fusion happens because you reach the conditions, and then the fusion converts the fuel into energy, and all that happens so fast that you don't need to insulate it. It just happens in a blink of an eye.
So CFS, Commonwealth Fusion Systems, your company, does magnetic fusion. But the thing that has achieved more energy out than in is inertial fusion. Can you talk us through the facility that has done it multiple times and the only facility on planet Earth?
Right. So all of these fusion ways to do it all have at the heart of it the same basic physics, right? And it actually goes to that physics from Eddington, the nuclear physics of how the reaction happens, and then the plasma physics of how do you have these very hot states of matter. If you take something and you melt solid to liquid and evaporate solid to gas, well, if you keep putting energy in, you get gas to plasma. And that's the state that the stars and everyone is in. So that means that the underlying science of everything is those fields, nuclear physics and plasma physics. And they're just different ways to apply that science. And the facility NIF that has reached more power out than in, the way it did it is it took a tiny, tiny pellet that had the fuel in it, that was in a gas, and it used...
How tiny are we talking?
About 2 millimeters. So like
wow.
the top of a pin. Right?
Ooh.
It took a tiny pellet, And then it used 192 of the world's largest lasers. And it fired those lasers with the precision of like 1 part in a billion timing onto this pellet and compressed the pellet like a factor of several hundred. So tiny pellet gets compressed.
So your 2 millimeter pellet becomes 0.002
tiny
millimeter.
Yes. It might even be more. I can't remember the exact. It's all in the papers. They publish it all in peer review, which is exactly what should be done. And when that happens, it compresses, it heats up, the density goes up, the temperature goes up, and the whole thing has a bang of fusion. And it all happens super fast.
Right. This is micro, milli, nanoseconds.
Nano level. And so that reaches the right conditions. When you calculate how much energy the lasers put into the pellet, and you then measure the amount of fusion power, the energy that came out, and you divide the two, you get the gain.
Right. And that happened almost exactly 100 years since Arthur Eddington produced his paper.
Mm-hmm.
And so after 100 years, we've been able to show this can be done on Earth, but all we've been able to show is we could make enough energy to heat a cup of coffee.
Right.
Now your company wants to do this so that it can produce power that can be put on the grid, and you want to do it before 2030.
Right. And so there's a couple things that are important there. One, NIF was never designed to be a power plant. It was designed to show the science worked. And so in that way, how much energy it made is immaterial, right? It reached the right conditions. Things went according to plan. And that was the big achievement. Like, science works, right? Now the step is, how do you turn that science that's been validated, that we've, in those 100 years, we came like somewhere around like 15 orders of magnitude in performance, faster than Moore's law for most of those 100 years. So that's a huge deal. And now we're at this cusp where you can start to think about how to make that practical. So how to make it so it's not just, a few times power out over in or energy out over in, but like more than that, 10. How to make it so it's not just megajoules, but gigajoules, and how to make it continuous so the plant is making megawatts. Those are the types of engineering tech challenges. And what we're trying to do at Commonwealth Fusion Systems is to demonstrate in a facility that you can handle those challenges.
And you're doing it through magnetic fusion. So talk us through exactly what that is and what is CFS's approach.
So in magnetic fusion, you build this magnetic bottle using very high strength magnets, and that can hold plasma. Plasma is charged, so it responds to magnetic fields. And in fact, that's like why the northern lights are so pretty. And it turns out if you build the right shape of magnetic bottle, the simplest shape is a shape that's kind of like a donut, it's like a bagel. You can use strong magnets and you can have a bagel of plasma. And the performance of that plasma, how hot and how dense and how well insulated it is, that will go like the magnetic field to the about 4th power. So it's very strongly dependent on the strength of the magnet. And we know this because we've built about 150 of these machines that are these donut-shaped machines, and they have a name called the tokamak from Soviet discovery, where they really figured out these machines in the 60s, and then everywhere around the world in the 70s they were built.
And if Americans had done it before, maybe they would have been called bagel reactors.
Yeah, who knows? Yeah. But, at the time, it was actually a cool story of, we were in the Cold War, and fusion was something that everyone had agreed they were all going to work on together because it's so hard, right? We'd been at it at that time like 40 years, and it's kind of like, well, we're going slower than we want. Let's all work together. So fusion's always been declassified. It's always been open. And the Soviets made this machine. They called it a tokamak, and it suddenly was 10 million degrees. They measured it was 10 million degrees. And the world was like, no way, right? So they sent the scientists from the UK with the laser, which had just been invented, over to measure the temperature of this newfangled device in the Soviet Union.
Right, clearly. Like, this is temperature we've never experienced. We don't even know what a thermometer would look like to actually measure it. Right. And so you had to invent a thermometer as well.
Yeah. And they go and they measure it, and like, sure enough, it's 10 million degrees. And that threshold of 10 million degrees is still today like an important threshold in judging where fusion ideas are. It was such a big leap at the time. And they published it in peer-reviewed journals, and like everyone's like, oh, awesome, big breakthrough, right? We have these tokamaks, they can get hot. And the world like went and built a bunch of tokamaks. And what we saw then in the 70s and 80s is a bunch of tokamaks that got higher and higher performance. But because of this magnetic field, they sort of ran out of headroom on how to make them higher performance because they ran into limits on the magnets. And the other way around that is to build them bigger.
Right. And this is where the biggest nuclear fusion experiment in the world comes into picture. It's called ITER. It's being built in France. It's already spent 20 billion euros. It's still not done.
Right. And so eventually it gets so big that, you learn a lot and you say, well, I only have access to a certain magnetic field because of the magnet technology. I can solve the science equations, and it says I got to build it big, like office block big. And so that's going to be expensive. Let's get all the world's governments together. Remember, we've been doing fusion out in the open. We'll make it a big science project like CERN. And you go out and you try to build this giant fusion machine. And it turns out that took longer than anyone thought and was more expensive than anyone thought. Some of it's technical. A lot of it is organizational. You can imagine a UN of science trying situation, right? And so they're partway through building it, and it's continually delayed. That's a problem.
And Bob, the PhD student, thinks, you know what, guys, this is too much. We should just make a small version of this and make this reaction actually work. Is that how CFS was born?
Not quite. But the parts of that are accurate was that we had known that if you had better magnets, you could make it much smaller. And that was an idea that was not a controversial idea at all. That was an idea that people at MIT had worked on, and people in Germany and the UK. And so we knew that was a possibility. But we didn't have the technology. And what changed is we, in the about 2010 timeframe, suddenly had a material science, a superconductor that was practical, that you could begin to think about, I could build really strong magnets, a new generation, a new class of very strong magnets. And if I did that, I know I can make those fusion machines, those tokamaks, much smaller. And that's what really underpinned the effort that became CFS and still is the fundamental technology inside CFS.
And the magnets that enable you to be able to make this tokamak smaller are called high temperature superconducting magnets. Now, those are lots of words, but superconducting is kind of self-explanatory, which is that conductors are things that carry electricity. When they carry electricity, they typically lose some of that in the form of heat because there is resistance as the electrons are flowing through that cable. Then you can make it a superconductor by trying to reduce that resistance to zero. And that was shown to happen by reducing the temperature to almost zero. But that's not great because getting to almost zero temperature takes a lot of energy. So if you want more energy out, that's a bad idea. And so they came up with high temperature superconductors, which are not absolute zero, but they're still pretty cold, right?
Yeah. So in the 80s, they discovered, and this was one of these things that was completely discovered experimentally. I mean, it was not predicted at all, like the opposite of Eddington.
Wait, so why is that the case? Because you know there's a conductor and it has resistance. Why can't you theorize that there could be zero resistance at some point?
Well, it turns out that you need in that conductor to be a very specific type of material that has some quantum mechanical effects. So effects that are not classical that would make it so that the resistance is zero. And it is identically zero. It's not like approaching zero. It drops from finite and actually pretty high to zero.
So it goes from sort of Newtonian science and then breaks it and goes to Einsteinian science and says, this is just a new way of actually running this material.
And when they discovered that, a guy named Henrik Ohms discovered that, and he won the Nobel Prize for that. And so that's exactly what happens, that you switch to quantum mechanics because of the materials, and it's cold, and all of a sudden it's a superconductor. The limitation is it needs to be very cold. And those are like a few degrees Kelvin, a few degrees above zero. But what they discovered in the 80s is there was a new class of material, a material that people didn't even think would be a superconductor. And it was a superconductor at 80 Kelvin. And so that's a huge deal. And they called that high temperature. And they won the Nobel Prize the year after they discovered that.
Right. That's 80 Kelvin is about minus 200 degrees Celsius.
Kelvin is about what you can do with liquid nitrogen. So that's like high school physics demonstration classroom
You
temperature.
take a rose, you dip it in liquid nitrogen, and then you pull it out, and then you smash it, and it breaks into pieces.
Exactly. Dippin' Dots.
And so high temperature superconductors are discovered in the 80s. You only started building your company in the 2020s, really.
Right. And so it's one thing to discover a material. It's another thing to make that material practical. And so really what the high temperature superconductor folks were doing is they were figuring out, well, how do I even grow this material? How do I make it? How do I make it into wires, right? It's a superconductor, so you need wires. And it wasn't really until about 2010 that you could even see wires out of this material of any appreciable length and anything that approached the quality you would need to make practical things. And so it wasn't until we saw that we realized, oh, now we can build a magnet technology on that material, continue to evolve the material as well. And that really was at the period where we started to lay the groundwork for CFS.
And what is this material?
This material, it's called rare earth barium copper oxide. But what it really is it's a crystal, and it's a ceramic that's grown. It's like grown like silicon computer chips. And most of it's copper, barium, and oxygen. It has a dopant, a tiny, tiny amount of a rare earth, yttrium usually. And it turns out when you grow that crystal and you grow it really well, like nearly perfect, it will be a superconductor when it's cold. But importantly for us, it's not just that it's higher temperature. In fact, that's actually not that important. The thing that's important is that all the other superconductors, they had this limitation that when they were in a magnetic field, the magnetic field would break the quantum mechanical effect. And so they would stop being a superconductor if they were in a magnetic field, particularly if the magnetic field got too high. And so here you're trying to build an electromagnet, a wire, that's making a magnetic field that limits itself by making a magnetic field. And that means that you have a hard limit. You can basically build magnets that were like 10-ish Tesla.
So a material that breaks itself.
Yeah. So not a great thing if you want to like build the highest magnet field in the world. But the high temperature superconductors also had a feature that they were high magnetic field superconductors. They didn't have this limit. The quantum mechanics was different. And once you realize that, you could immediately say, oh, if I had a bunch of this material and then I figured out a whole bunch of other technology, I could build really, really strong magnets.
And so on the basis of that, CFS is now among only a handful of climate tech startups that have raised billions of dollars in money. That's a lot of money for a climate tech startup. Not for Microsoft, but for a climate tech startup, a lot of money. Few startups even need that much money to reach commercial viability. So before we come to how you're planning to spend it all, tell us, how did you convince private investors who back ideas that actually become commercial reality and want return on these ideas, not just scientific work, to give you all that money?
Right. So at this point, you have the fact that fusion, we always knew it was a big deal, right? If you had a fusion power plants, that could potentially be a huge business. That could be a business, scale of the oil industry, right? Huge business. We knew that it was scientifically possible, not yet done, but like scientifically possible. And we knew that if you could build very strong magnets, you could make it much smaller and it would put it in the realm of commercially doable. And you basically had like a $50 billion statement of conviction by the governments that the tokamak and ITER was going to work if you could build it. And now all of a sudden you have this material that takes all that and puts it within the reach of something that would look kind of like a SpaceX, right? In terms of scale and engineering, et cetera.
Right. So if ITER is NASA, CFS is SpaceX.
Yeah. Certainly people had boiled it down to that. I wouldn't necessarily say that, but other people have. And so all that came together. It's at MIT, it's all peer reviewed, and it makes a really, pretty simple roadmap. Go build that magnet technology, show it works. Go build a tokamak that makes a lot of energy, more power out than in, using the science we already know. And then go build power plants based on that machine. And that's a digestible, falsifiable, peer-reviewable path. And that's the path that we've been on since before the company was a company. That's been a path that we've been on for about 10 years now. And through that, you can look and say, okay, at each execution stage, how's it going? Is the team actually doing what it said it's going to do? And by 2021, we had taken $200 million. We had spun out of MIT. We'd built a team, and we had demonstrated that magnet technology and shown that it could scale. And we designed the fusion tokamak spark and peer-reviewed it, done the engineering, found the site, figured out how we were going to go build that machine. And that's when we raised the $1.8 billion to go and build it. And now we're about halfway through building that.
And what does it look like, building it?
Well, it's big. Like, it's smaller than ITER, but you're still talking about having to build a factory to make those magnets. So we have a factory that runs 3 shifts, that is full of hundreds of people, that makes superconducting magnets that simply did not exist before, based on materials that won the Nobel Prize multiple times. You had to do that. You have to find a place where they're like, let you do that. And so we own 50 acres outside of Boston, an old military base. And on that site with the factory, we have a fusion prototype power plant. And, it's buildings that are made to hold fusion machines. And in there is, we haven't yet started assembling. We're getting ready to start assemble of tokamak, which we've built 150 before, but never one that was this powerful and never one that had these magnets in it. And so it looks like a big construction project. It looks like a big engineering project. It looks like a manufacturing project. And I think that looks like actually what climate tech is going to look like for just about every climate tech innovation at scale.
And so you're waiting to land this joke, which is nuclear fusion, great idea. It's the future. It's always in the future. And you're going to go, haha, we made it happen.
We're going to go and say, look, show up at this place, push a button, and make a whole bunch of heat from a reaction that built all the atoms on Earth, that powers the sun, and do that with a team that built it all quickly out of sight in a factory with blueprints. And we think that's very compelling.
You're also going to not just make fusion reaction, you are going to turn it into power at that facility, and you're going to do it before 2030.
So that facility will make fusion reactions that will make a bunch of heat. So we won't turn it into electricity. But if we had turned it into electricity, which means basically making that heat go into steam and turning a steam turbine, if we'd done that with stuff that already exists, off-the-shelf stuff, that facility would be able to have sold some electricity, but we didn't demonstrate those pieces.
But a tokamak reactor, this bagel-shaped machine you're building, will produce heat. Nobody has yet shown how to capture all that heat, turn it into steam to generate power. So there's still one more step beyond the hardest step that still needs to be shown to work, right?
That's right, but that step is fairly conventional. That's a step that, say, a coal power plant does. It captures heat and turns it to steam and turns that steam into a turbine and electricity. And fusion in that way is not that dissimilar than other ways to boil water.
Well, sure, but the whole point of a nuclear fusion reactor that you want to build is one that will continuously generate heat. A continuously heating unit needs to take that heat away. And so if you are not readying yourself to do that, regardless of whether you want to turn that heat into power or not, you're not going to run this reactor on a continuous basis.
Yeah, so the one that we're building right now, we'll run it for short periods because it does get hot and you can't take the heat out at the rate that you generate it. It's basically too small to take the heat out. But we have then in parallel efforts that are like, well, this is how you take the heat out. And those are fairly conventional.
And so when will we have a CFS plant that actually generates power?
That's the next piece in the milestone. So what we are right now is to build a machine that does the really fusion-specific pieces and does it in a way that's like, that's a snapshot of how a plant would work.
And that will be ready and doing it when?
We think that'll be ready in like 2027. So right now we're about halfway through building it, and sort of the end of 2024 we'll be manufacturing the parts, and in 2025 we'll be starting to assemble all the parts, and the big pieces of equipment will be installed in the buildings. And in 26, we'll start to turn on individual subsystems that support the fusion machine. And eventually at 26 and 27, the fusion reactions, and then more power out than in Q greater than 1 and 27. And so that's a very fast timeline compared to what we've used to doing in fusion, right? So, big effort, but, the talent that is at CFS, that's the type of challenge that they live for. And then after that, the next step is to do that same thing a little bit bigger, make more power, but very similar in its parameters, and then put that at a site that has the ability to turn that heat into steam, to electricity, and then sell the electricity. And that is our next machine, a machine we call ARC.
And how many more billions is that going to take?
That's going to take a similar amount to what we've already raised.
So about $2 billion.
Yeah, give or take,
Right. And the aim to have the arc reactor generating power is by what date?
So we want to do that so it's in the early 2030s. A lot of that depends on when we start, which depends on things like, well, how confident are we in Spark? Do we wait to finish all of Spark? Do we get started a little early? Do we wait to get more results out of it? There's a sort of a start date that you have to figure out. And there's how long will it take to build. And that's one of the reasons that we're building Spark is we're getting how long it takes, what are the challenges, what does the supply chain look like, how much does it cost, the receipts, in addition to the actual science of how it works.
After the break, are there too many fusion startups? And if you've been enjoying this episode, please take a moment to rate and review the show on Spotify, Apple, or now YouTube. It helps other listeners find the show. There are now 50 nuclear fusion startups by one count. In total, they've raised about $6 billion, which means CFS alone has raised about a third of all that. Are there too many nuclear fusion startups?
Well, I think what you're seeing is a growing ecosystem. So in those that count, many of those are companies that aim to build power plants. Like, if you think what CFS is, we would consider CFS like a tier 1 integrator. We're like a Ford, right? But Ford buys parts from people that like AC Delco that make parts that go into Ford, but also go into Chevy. And so we're starting to see now in Fusion the emergence of those tier 2 suppliers. And in the continuing the car analogy, there's people that make high-end cars that fit that market, pickups and sedans. And you see that in Fusion as well. You see, okay, can you make a really small fusion machine, a fusion machine that just generates heat, a fusion machine that might be more speculative scientifically, so maybe it's a next generation one. And so while there's a lot, when you actually break them down and say, are we out of good ideas? No. Are we done building new fusion machines? I don't think we ever will be. But is it an ecosystem? Yes. You can start to see the emergence of an ecosystem, and eventually, like in a world where there's a fusion industry, that's a standalone industry. That's an important industry. It's an asset class. And so, my history of technology hat is like, no, this feels about right.
Yeah, I mean, we put it on the climate timeline, and that raises a bunch of questions about whether if you build it by, say, 2035, will you be able to build 100 of them by 2050 or 1,000 of them if we need, right? Because we want clean, firm power and we want lots of it. But if you're thinking about it from a species perspective, from a planet that has intelligent beings perspective, you would want to give them nuclear fusion power. That would be pretty useful, regardless of what problems they have. Having access to unlimited clean energy is very useful.
Right. If you think about like technology, and we're sitting here at a conference, it's about innovation and climate. The crazy thing about technology is that once you have it and know it, it takes on a life of its own. And it could scale way faster than we thought. I really doubt that when Henry Ford was building the Model T, which, cars existed before the Model T, I'm sure there was doubters like, oh, that's going to grow at like 20%. I mean, the Model T production grew at 100% year over year for 10 years. Like if you did that in climate, in any of the climate technologies, not only do you solve climate in 10 years, but like you basically like lead to an entirely different civilization, right? And so that's the cool thing about technology. And the idea that you could have a technology like fusion that basically uses an entirely new process in a machine that we basically manufacture, that's like why it's a intellectually and wide open space. Very cool.
Thank you both.
All right, thank you.
Thank you for listening to Zero. And now for the sound of the week. That's the sound from inside a fusion reactor. Not at CFS, but at another nuclear fusion startup called Zap Energy, which I visited 2 years ago and which is also racing to bring fusion power onto the grid. If you like this episode, please take a moment to rate or review the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Share this episode with a friend or with someone who loves science fiction. You can get in touch at zeropod@bloomberg.net. Zero's producer is Maithili Rao. Bloomberg's head of podcasts is Sage Bauman, and head of talk is Brendan Noonan. Our theme music is composed by Wonderly. Thanks to Breakthrough Energy for the space to record this episode. Special thanks also to Kira Bindram and Monique Mulima. I am Akshat Rathi, back soon.